To call Griffith's war demons enigmatic would be an understatement. We've known one of them since pretty much the beginning of the series, and we still don't have a single concrete detail about why he's the way he is. We just know that he's been alive for 300 years and he craves a good fight more than a bloody Viking. With his other war demons, we still get a little bit of a backstory. Locus was a legendary knight, Rakshas was an infamous assassin, and there's an entire light novel based on Grunbeld's origins called Berserk, the Flame Dragon Knight, which you can catch up on by checking out our video on the same. But if there's one person who remains a complete mystery, it's Irvine. The enigmatic hunter apostle rarely speaks and only shows up when his services are required, which is often considering he's Griffith's best archer, bar none. You guys saw the question we posed in the video's title, right? Well, let's get into breaking down how that works and why Irvine's entire body is a weapon by dissecting his anatomy. Who is Irvine? How did he become an apostle? But before we do all that, let's address the mystery of his identity. Who exactly is Irvine, and how did he become an apostle in the first place? For that, we have to take a look at his interaction with Sonia in chapter 250. After getting jealous of the fact that Griffith had to marry Princess Charlotte for his dream to come true, Sonia wanders off into the forest looking for some peace and quiet. Instead, she finds Irvine sitting at the bank of a river with a fire in front of him and a lute in his hands. He slows down his playing when he sees Sonia approach and tells her to do as she pleases when she asks if she can share his fire. Sonia listens to his song and compliments it when he's done, but calls it lonely as well. She comments that Irvine often spends his time off duty by his lonesome and asks him why that is, to which he replies that he's a hunter and hunters feel calmer alone. She asks him if hunters are always alone, and this prompts him to give the equivalent of his backstory. Irvine comments that there are others that do hunt in groups, but not him. He chases after his prey for days, if not weeks, lurking about in the mountains and jungles, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Irvine gets so engrossed in the hunt that he often loses track of time. And now, after spending so much time lost in that fog, he too had become a beast. Sonia takes this to mean that the group was allowed to share whenever, so she went next, commenting on how she too was lonely in this world thanks to her powers. She muses about the fact that she needs someone to take care of her as much as Princess Charlotte does, but then she nods off and Irvine simply acknowledges her words and puts a blanket over her shoulders. So what does this tell us about who he is and how he became an apostle? Well, it gives us enough clues for us to start making some informed guesses. If we had to guess, we'd say Irvine was a well-renowned hunter back in the day, like he mentions in his story. Because he doesn't fight on the front lines, Irvine doesn't wear heavy-plated armor like the rest of his war demon brethren. Instead, he opts for what looks like a riding outfit, complete with a Robin Hood hat and a lute for when he gets bored. We suspect the lute is connected to whoever he sacrificed in his previous life to gain his current one, because apostles can be pretty attached to things like that. If not, that just makes Irvine the Gurney Halleck of Berserk, but he's far more silent than that Atreides legend. It's likely that during one particularly difficult hunt, Irvine was injured by his mark, and he needed to make a choice between dying without victory and being reincarnated as something far more than human. He clearly chose the latter, considering he's an apostle today. Irvine sacrificed the person that was closest to him in exchange for the promise of the hunt of a lifetime and a body appropriate for participating in the same. He emerged from the interstice armed with the knowledge that if he sought out the Falcon of Light, his heart's deepest desires would be fulfilled. So that's exactly what he does. Irvine doesn't join Griffith at Shet like the rest of his captains. He makes his debut in chapter 192 during the Battle of Lumius, and immediately makes his presence felt with what he accomplishes. In a single motion, Irvine beheads 6 Kushan soldiers from a distance that should be impossible for any archer to cover, no matter how skilled they are. Irvine's archery skills become critical to the reborn Band of the Falcon's victories, because no matter how well or poorly a battle is progressing, Irvine's presence always changes the tide in the war demon's favor. This is bizarre considering, well, the man doesn't have irises to see with. His sockets have eyeballs within them, but they might as well be cue balls given how chalk white they are. This kind of eye design is only observed in manga when a character suffers from some sort of visual impairment, because unlike the Bakiraka clan, Irvine can't turn this off or actually see through it. So if his eyesight is similar to that of a final stage cataract patient, how exactly does he see? Well, this is where we stop speculating on his origins and elaborate on his gifts as an apostle. Does Irvine share his vision with his bow? Is the bow a part of his body? Irvine's human form can be quite unsettling, granted what we've just discussed, but it gets even more disturbing when we realize that he does actually have one eye, it's just located on his bow. Every time we see a close-up of Irvine shooting his bow, we can clearly see a gigantic eye right in the middle of his bow. This means that his anatomy is linked to his bow, and the bow eye gives him far superior eyesight than even a sniper's scope can. In chapter 192, we see Irvine fire off about a half dozen arrows towards the Kushan at the same time. This is a separate volley from the one where he decapitated folks, and don't worry, we'll get to how he did that in a moment. If you follow the panels closely enough, you'll notice that we get a POV of Irvine measuring the distance between himself and his targets. That's coming from the eye on his bow, which makes it all the more evident that it is that eye that actually does the seeing for Irvine. It must be a damn special eye to have depth perception and all packed into a single apparatus, but that isn't even the crazy part. Irvine's bow isn't just an extension of his body, it's a part of his body that he uses as an extension when in his human form. Confused? We'll explain. Irvine has one of the most unique apostle transformations in the series, in that it has a point of origin that lies outside of his body. In chapter 332, we see Irvine assume his apostle form on panel, and it's unlike anything we've seen before. Most of the time, when an apostle takes their released form, they do so by simply changing their physical forms, kind of like Titans, blowing out smoke and being covered in flames and everything. But with Irvine, you can clearly tell that the point of origin for his transformation is his bow, because the eye in the middle of it is what triggers said transformation. So how does this prove that the bow is a part of Irvine's body? Well, it's all in the details. Irvine's bow doesn't look like a regular bow. It isn't made out of wood, it's made from what appears to be horns, fashioned to look like a bow. Now, take a close look at the front of Irvine's apostle body and tell us if you notice anything similar. That's right, folks, the bow is actually the horns that adorn the wolf head of Irvine's released form. We'll address that in a little bit, but it makes perfect sense when you superimpose the bow over his horns. Even the eye is placed perfectly in the middle of the wolf's head, just how it was in the bow. When Irvine is in his released form, he uses his horns as a bow, and it is far more lethal than its regular form because of the curvature of his horns. The Mongols used curved bows which had soft, bendy ends, not because they were easier to carry, but because the curvature gave their arrows far more speed and precision than, say, a conventional longbow. This formed the foundation of their horse archery, which is what allowed them to create the largest territorial empire known to man. Irvine uses that same principle to shoot arrows at his enemies, 6 at a time on occasion. But if you have ever seen the distances his arrows cover and the feats they perform, you may have asked yourself this question at least once. Are Irvine's arrows some form of black magic? Because if we didn't know any better, we'd think that Irvine could control his arrows like Yondu Udonta. Can Irvine control his arrows? If we are to just look at the sheer distances that Irvine's arrows can cover, you could definitely think that there's some sort of homing system embedded within them. This is because they manage to go across entire battlefields without missing, and that kind of thing doesn't just happen no matter how juiced up your bow is. Then, there's also the fact that Irvine decapitates his targets with arrows, something that just isn't possible from an anatomical perspective. Arrows cannot realistically blow a man's head completely off their shoulders. They're piercing weapons by nature. Yes, they can run through you, but once they hit something, their momentum slows down. Flesh, bone, any sort of body armor that a man is wearing will ensure that his body isn't blown apart from a single projectile. But Irvine straight up beheads soldiers with his arrows, which means he crushes through their C1 and C2 spinal bones as well. When a person takes an arrow to the neck, it definitely skewers said neck like a rather grim roast chicken. But rarely does it decapitate people, and never with Irvine's consistency. So, is he controlling his arrows? Well, it appears not, and there's evidence for it within the series. It's not that Irvine is controlling his arrows, it's just that he's that good at judging distance. And the incredible force with which he fires his arrows is down to him being an apostle. In chapter 234, Locus confronts Emperor Ganishka's demonic troops in what was a surprise attack. The real surprise came when Irvine and his archers showed up while the Demon King was enjoying the show, and the hunter himself loosed an arrow in Ganishka's direction. Now, if Irvine were able to control his arrows, he'd have been able to do something about what happened next. The hunter apostle aimed at Ganishka's heart to eliminate any possibility of him surviving, but he didn't account for the fact that the dude will just turn into fog. Irvine's arrow flew straight through Ganishka's chest, and if he could control it, he'd have tried to have it come around for a second and third pass. You know, like Yondu used to do with his head arrow. But instead, his arrow just flies through, presumably hitting the wall behind the Dread Emperor. As for the decapitations, well, that one just comes down to power. Irvine has all the strength of an apostle, and him concentrating it into one motion must compress it all into a burst that allows his arrows to do the unthinkable. So there you have it, the mystery of Irvine's arrows solved. Now, let's move on to the bigger question. Why in the world is his lower body a massive one-eyed direwolf? Why does Irvine's apostle form look like a wolf centaur? How it makes him the perfect weapon? Calling Irvine's apostle form one of a kind would actually be an understatement. It's the single most bizarre thing we've ever seen in the coolest way possible. Now, Berserk isn't a stranger to revising mythical creatures and giving them decidedly more demonic roots. Grunbeld is an evil dragon, Locus is an evil centaur. That apostle with an owl face on its chest from chapter 301 reminds us of a harpy, but Irvine is like a combination between two mythical creatures, with the overall silhouette resembling an entirely different one altogether. In his transformed state, Irvine looks like a centaur with the upper body of a satyr and the lower body of a direwolf. You didn't hear that wrong, and there are reasons for it, which we'll now get into. Let's start with the upper body. Irvine looks like a demonic satyr with horns coming out of his eyebrows and claws replacing his nails. His hair turns into a mane, and his body is covered in thick fur which blends into his lower body. This half has more symbolic importance because it's a manifestation of Irvine's desire to become the ideal hunter. You'll recall that in his conversation with Sonia in chapter 250, he repeatedly called himself alone, almost as if he were comparing himself to a lone wolf. Turns out that was exactly the case, and the reason Irvine's lower body looks like a direwolf's is because he thinks wolves are the ideal predators. Sorry, lone wolves, to be precise. There are major differences between a regular direwolf and the bottom half of Irvine's apostle. For starters, direwolves possess two eyes, whereas Irvine's wolf only has the one, which we already addressed when we explained how his bow was a part of his body. Speaking of which, unlike direwolves, Irvine's wolf body also has a pair of horns, which are as large as reindeer antlers, but not quite as wild. Irvine's antlers are uniformly shaped to allow him to fire arrows through them, and they also have a set of mini horns in the middle of the big ones on which he can rest his projectiles and steady his aim. His wolf body will give him far greater mobility than the hooves of a centaur, and mobility is crucial considering Irvine often hunts in terrains that are least suited for horses. Wolves can pretty much traverse any sort of landscape, and they have a greater advantage in forests and such when compared to horses. Irvine's wolf head can also bite the head off of whoever's in front of him, so that gives him an extra layer of protection as well as a convenient weapon in his arsenal. Everything we've said so far should give you an idea as to why we think Irvine's apostle body is the perfect weapon, but we haven't even gotten to the biggest reason yet. When we were talking about his horns, did you stop to wonder where he actually gets his arrows from? In his base form, Irvine carries a quiver like any other man. He's got backup arrows, and he often stays several steps ahead in terms of preparation as he plants arrows in the ground so he can immediately draw and loose them. He certainly can carry a quiver with him in his released form if he needs to, but they aren't big enough to fire with his natural bow. Regular arrows wouldn't even make it halfway past Irvine's wolf belly, let alone be big enough to actually be positioned properly. So how does he solve this problem? It's simple. He uses his fur. When we said that Irvine wished to become the absolute pinnacle of a predator with his apostle wish, we weren't kidding. Whenever Irvine has to fire an arrow in his released form, he simply plucks some of his fur or a hair from his tail, and it morphs into a gigantic arrow, which he can now position and aim however he wants. Moreover, these fur arrows don't work like regular arrows either. In fact, upon impact, they're more like the Berserker armor in that they riddle their targets' bodies with countless spikes. Irvine's apostle arrows always expand once they make contact with a target. Once that happens, they release thorny, spine-like protrusions which then find their way through every single internal organ in their bodies. By the time that's done killing them, they look like someone just stuffed multiple spiked baseball bats inside their bodies the wrong direction. That's not how anybody wants to go out. Just ask the cockatrice that Irvine killed in chapter 333, which got turned into mulch from the inside by his Hawkeye arrows. So, not only does he have a practically endless supply of ammunition, his ammo is so destructive it simply cannot leave targets alive. And, to top all of that off, when fired, the arrow's trajectory and impact is more similar to a ballista than an arrow. Just take a look at this shot of Irvine preparing to skewer the cockatrice from chapter 333, or this one of him charging into enemy lines and turning 4 of Ganishka's pseudos into shish kebab for the sake of the New World from chapter 301. He looks like a goddamn organic scorpion from the Roman Empire, and that's what makes him the perfect weapon. Irvine's apostle form is the total package. His wolf body gives him a massive advantage over his enemies when it comes to things like tracking, racing, and outpacing. The fact that his fur is his ammo means that he has a practically endless supply as long as it keeps growing back. His fur can also turn into involuntary sea urchins within a target's body, thus killing them inside and out. And, best of all, he's a traveling ballista that can be used to great offensive or defensive effect, whichever side the ball lands on. He would be invaluable on either side of a siege or battlefield, because anyone that can take out enemy soldiers from a hill where they can barely see them deserves those kills. Irvine is pretty much a self-sustaining war machine, and that's why we called his apostle form the perfect weapon. But just because it prepares him for any kind of job, does Irvine's unique body also make him the strongest? Is Irvine the most powerful war demon? What is his role in the endgame of Berserk? Even in niche discussions about which war demon of Griffith's is the strongest, Irvine's name never wins out, and that could be because of the archer bias. Archers have always had it bad, even though fantasy is the one genre where they usually flourish. But what you might have picked up on having come this far into the video is that Irvine is the archer when it comes to Berserk. And the fact that his apostle body is built for warfare and hunting just tells you that he doesn't need to be the strongest to be the most lethal. In chapter 356, when Griffith takes his army out to hunt down giants, Irvine takes up position on a hill overseeing the enemy's camps. He positions himself in such a way that when he fires at the heads of the Hydra in the giant's possession, he doesn't give himself away, and he takes out 3 heads as a bonus. Irvine has been a silent yet impactful presence in Griffith's plans ever since he joined the band, as evidenced by his performance at the Battle of Lumius, the Battle for the New World, his hunt for the cockatrice, and many other instances. He doesn't seem to be the strongest apostle by any means because ranged fighters are usually terrible at melee, but Irvine is one of Griffith's most important apostles, chiefly because there is no other archer like him in the entire world of Berserk. Irvine is the leader of the reborn Band of the Falcon's archers, and a part of his duty is to keep his men in line, as evidenced by chapter 194. When he saw a few apostles picking on Sonya and Mule, he fired an arrow in their direction to warn them that the next time he wouldn't be missing. As the series has progressed, he has also found himself becoming Sonya's second guardian, as he takes over looking after her when Mule is predisposed. But Irvine also reports on stamping out prison breaks to Griffith in clandestine meetings, as we all saw in chapter 372. So what is his real role in the band and the endgame of Berserk? Well, he's a hunter, so we suspect he'll be sent out on a hunt, and we think we know who the target's gonna be. At this point in the story, the biggest problem for Griffith isn't Guts, or Rickert, or Salat, or even Daiba for that matter. It's Shirke. The prodigious young mage is currently using her ethereal body to find a way to break Casca out of Falconia, and she's also well acquainted with Sonya. Shirke's progress as a witch has been so staggering that she might soon become the next Flora, not just for namesake, but in power levels as well. And with her being set firmly against Griffith, that makes her his biggest problem. Now, in chapter 372, Irvine reports to Griffith that the bird's flight had ended. Considering this chapter is titled The Red Raven Sleeps in the Birdcage, and Casca did try to escape out of said birdcage, it would make total sense for her to be the bird Irvine was referring to. But what if it's Sonya? That girl might be starry-eyed and madly in love with Griffith, but she doesn't lack morals. She was shocked when she saw Griffith return with Casca, and we're sure she asked him some questions he couldn't have her discussing with anyone else. If Irvine helped her put down Sonya, someone he's been acting like a friend to, then there's no limit that he wouldn't cross in service of his master. And, being a hunter, his ultimate purpose in Berserk seems to be carrying out a major assassination, and his target will most likely be either Shirke or Guts. Whether he succeeds or not is something only time and causality can tell us, so we're gonna have to just wait until that chapter comes out. Marvelous verdict! But for now, we're afraid this is where we'll have to end the video because that's all we've got for you guys. Irvine is definitely the most unique war demon out of all of Griffith's captains, and we hope we were able to explain to you why his apostle body is actually the perfect weapon. Let us know your thoughts in the comments section down below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more Berserk content, and we'll see you guys in the next one. Until then, keep on struggling, strugglers.